45 minutes or so, we're going to talk about a few things. First is, how do we get our land in shape for a long-term perennial crop like grapes. We're going to talk some about some of the pest issues we want to deal with, nematodes and perennial weeds, fertility for grapes, and then finally, kind of how do we actually go about the nuts and bolts of actually getting a vineyard established. So just for the sake of our conversation, how many folks have vines in the ground for a year or more? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, lots of you. And how many folks have had vines in the ground for more than 5 years? Well, we have quite a bit of experience in the room. So all the tough questions can go to you guys too. There you go. We'll talk about vineyard layout, how we actually set up the trellis system. We're not going to get into a lot of detail about the different types of trellis. We're mostly going to talk about BSP, and then training first-year vines. So that's really what we're going to do. But essentially, we're going to start from here. Anybody recognize where this is? I'll give you a prize if you do, if you haven't seen this before.
Mount St. Helens.
No, close. Actually, it's not that close. This is actually from South America. This is the slash and burn agriculture. This is they were planting pineapples in that field the next year. So this is truly where you're starting from nothing. Hopefully your site doesn't look quite like that. And we're going to go to a vineyard that's well on its way to be established. So what are all the different steps to get from there to here? So we're going to start with nematodes. So nematodes are one of those issues that either pretty much you have them or you don't. And if you do have them, it adds a whole nother level of complexity to vineyard establishment. There are a number of nematodes that we're worried about, particularly this dagger nematode, because it can not only cause direct damage to root tips, but it also can vector various viruses, and those viruses can cause long-term vine decline. So what are nematodes? Nematodes are basically microscopic worms. You can't see them. There's lots of different nematodes in the soil, thousands of different species. There's 5 or 10 in this area that really cause some issues. I am from Southern Maryland and from tobacco country, so I have to throw a few tobacco pictures in there. So this is actually root knot nematode in a tobacco field. So what do we notice from this field? Do you see the damage here is kind of circular, and we have kind of an epicenter of damage there. This is also very sandy ground. It was farmed continuously in ag crops for a long time. So that's kind of what you see as a general decline in the crop. And more directly, this is not grapes, but just another example of the direct damage they cause to roots. This happens to be root knot nematode, and you can see that knotting or galling of the roots there. So obviously, if you have that sort of damage on your roots of your vine crop, particularly in that first 2 to 3 years when they're getting established, they're just not going to perform well for the long term. So how do you know if you have nematodes? Anybody have any idea? Yes, sir. Yes, the only way you actually look for them. So fortunately for our friends at Virginia Tech, thank you very much. John Eisenbach is the nematologist at Virginia Tech, has graciously agreed to accept samples from Maryland. That's where all of my samples go to. So John is in his lab actually is going to take that, so you take a soil sample, he's going to put some solution in that sample, and then he's actually going to count the species of nematodes that are actually present for a certain amount of soil, and he's going to give you a report back. This is the most recent report that I got from John a couple weeks ago on threshold levels for various species of nematodes in grapes. So there's going to be different categories here. You want to be in this category, which is typically not going to cause a problem. Then there's a moderate category, which means that they can cause issues if growing conditions are unfavorable, if the plants are stressed. And then, of course, you have this last category in red, which means you're likely to have a problem and you need to take some steps to try to remediate that before planting. So unfortunately, we do get samples back that are high. The other issue with nematodes is once you plant the vineyard, there's very, very few options for remediating and getting those nematode numbers to decline. So this is something we have to do before we plant the vines. Sampling, we want to make sure that we sample when the nematodes are active, so that means not now. It means typically we want the soil to be about 50 degrees. In my area in southern Maryland, that typically is going to happen sometime around May 1st. The ideal time to sample would be in the fall. You take the sample the same way you do a soil sample, 15 to 10 cores throughout the area that you're going to plant, 6 to 8 inch depth. Remember that the nematodes are living. If you put them in the dash of the truck, so in the heat in the middle of the summer where it gets 120 degrees, you're going to kill them. You want to treat them like you would like to be treated. When you ship them, make sure you ship them in a way that they're going to get to the lab quickly. So 50 degrees is the minimal temperature that we like to see. What we often see with, how many folks are planning to plant vines for the first time this spring? Anybody? Oh, that's good. Well, maybe a couple of you. So the call that Dave and I really like is the folks that call up in, what is it, Dave, February, March, say, Ben, I bought a piece of land. I've heard that grapes are a really good thing to plant in this area, and I ordered my vines. I'm going to put them in, and they're arriving April 20th, and what do I need to do to get ready? So what do we tell those folks? Oops, yes. Cancel your order, please. So it's impossible in February or March to get a good job, get a good sense of how many nematodes you actually have present, and also do this other soil conditioning that we need. So we like to have at least 2 years to try to prepare the site for planting. So this information is in on your flash drive, but there's the address to the Virginia Tech Nematode Assay Lab. If you go to this website here, the nematode sample form is available for you. It's also on the flash drive as well. So besides nematodes, the other issue we're going to be concerned with is going to be soil fertility. So the good thing about soil fertility is that's something that can be changed pretty easily. We can correct kind of the chemical nature of that soil, phosphorus, potash, pH, things of that nature. Pretty easy process. You do want to use a soil probe. If you don't have one, the extension offices in every county will have these probes that you can borrow. Using a probe ensures that you get a nice consistent sample at that 6 to 8 inch depth. So there's also, we put this card on your flash drive as well, so it just kind of describes how you go about taking that soil sample. You want to make sure that you're taking samples from like areas. So once you decide what site you're going to select, you want to go to that site and make sure that sites that have similar cropping history, so you wouldn't want to sample a cornfield with a soybean field. You want to separate those out, especially important if you have different manure history as well. We mix that sample up, dry the sample, and then we're going to send it away to a soil sampling lab. There's a number of different labs in the Mid-Atlantic area that you can use. The one closest to us is Agro Lab, which is over on the Eastern Shore. Bill Rohr, I believe, is a member of the Maryland Grape Growers Association and does a lot of work with grape growers. So I always like using local labs. There's also Waypoint. Penn State has a lab you can use. But the idea is we want to make sure that we get an analysis to see what the actual fertility level of that soil is. So here's a list of those various labs. Again, there's 11 of them. This document is also in your flash drive that you can refer to. Again, the extension offices can help you with this. If you need help submitting that sample or filling out the paperwork, just visit them. We have full-time nutrient management advisors. That's all they do is process soil samples and provide recommendations for you on what you need to do to remediate that soil. This is just an example of the report that you would get back from a lab. This happens to be from Agro Lab, and you can see we have things like pH. So this soil has a pH of 6.7, which is in the ideal range. Fairly high phosphorus levels at 97, but our potash levels there are in the deficient range. So this particular soil, we know that we don't need to add lime. We don't need much phosphorus, but we will need to concentrate on getting those potash levels up. So you're going to get a pretty substantial recommendation for potash. Again, the nutrient management advisors can develop specific recommendations for you. This is just an example based on that, based on a previous soil sample. Recommends no nitrogen, 90 pounds of phosphorus, and 59 pounds of potash per acre, and requiring 2.4 tons per acre of lime. So this is not based on this last soil sample, by the way. It's just an example of what that would look like. So you have a very specific recipe for what you need for that actual field. Any questions on soil sampling or nematode sampling? Okay. So a couple things with grapevine nutrition. This is often a kind of overlooked aspect. pH issues can take up to a year to correct. So this is another reason why we like to have a 1 to 2 year period. If we need to add lime to allow that lime to react and actually affect a change in soil pH. Again, we'd like to have that pH somewhere up near 6.2, 6.8 if possible. We really don't like starting at a lower pH because it's very difficult to get that lime incorporated down through the soil profile once those vines are planted. Now with grapevines, it's not like a soybean crop or a corn crop where we rely typically solely on a soil test. With grapevines, we really need to rely upon tissue test and visual assessment of how those vines are doing over time. And so once you take the soil test initially, you're going to add the lime, phosphorus, potash, any micronutrients that soil test is calling for. Then when those vines start to growing, particularly in the second, third, fourth year, you're going to rely upon those tissue tests and visual assessment. You know, how much vine vigor do you have in relation to nitrogen? Do we have any potassium or phosphorus deficiencies or magnesium deficiencies that are actually showing up and are confirmed? This is just an example of how we determine how much lime we need based upon what soil pH we start with and what pH we actually want to end with. This is the tons of lime that we would require. So there's a chart that you can use, or again, just come to the extension office and we will calculate the exact amount based upon your soil type. Realize that soil pH does affect nutrient availability. So you can see once that pH starts to get down in this area below 5.5, particularly down near 5, things like phosphorus get bound up in the soil by aluminum or iron. You also see a great reduction in the amount of calcium available, the amount of molybdenum available. Also, the other thing can happen as well. If we get a pH that's too high, we often end up with problems with manganese and iron and zinc. So that's why we like to be right in this range here where most of those nutrients are ideally available for the vine. All right, so switching gears a little bit, and let's talk about preparing that field. Everybody's going to be starting from a little different place. I think this list came from Penn State. So what do you have actually out in that field? Vines, trees, brush, rocks, old fencing, cars and refrigerators, vineyard perimeter, burning fields. What are you actually starting from? And so we're going to have a little different perspective based upon where you're going to start from as to what you need to do. There's 4 kind of typical methods that we would use. One is where we're going to completely renovate that field. So that means we're going to completely till the field, create a cultivated surface. We're basically starting over. The second method is we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to do basically a no-till method where we're planting through an established sod. The third method is if you have an existing crop residue, for example, a soybean crop the previous year, planting through that existing residue. And then finally, the most extensive method would be the biorenovation program, and that's particularly useful if you have nematode issues. So I think Joe showed this slide before. So what does clean till mean? That means when you start with a field, you're tilling all the residue under. You typically go through a primary tillage followed by secondary tillage. Typically we're going to do that in the fall, and then we're going to get our fescue, our sod established, and then plant the crop the following spring. A lot of times that will involve subsoiling or ripping. So this is a ripper here. I think this is a parabolic ripper. So the idea there is we're breaking up, if we have soils that have a hard pan a compaction layer, we could rip those to break that up. So this is a really old picture. This is a moldboard plow. This is what we call a primary tillage. This is the picture that we typically show. This is what we don't want to do anymore in modern agriculture, because we really promote, no-till and conservation till and minimum till, where we're trying to retain all this crop residue. But if you have a field that's in pretty rough shape, or if you have a field that has a very low pH and you need to get that lime incorporated, then primary tillage such as this one time can be a useful tool. We would follow that primary tillage. We could use a chisel plow as another primary tillage method. And then we're going to follow that with secondary tillage. This is a disc where we're going through and leveling that soil up and mixing that soil together to prepare that nice fine seed bed. So this requires a lot of work. This is for sites that you're not starting in a field that's in good shape. You either have a lot of ruts, you have poor soil fertility, and you need to renovate and basically give that a fresh start. Does everybody see where I'm coming from with that? Okay. Now the opposite of that is if you have a field that's in pretty good shape. So we do have a lot of places where we already have a nice established sod there. We have nice level soil. The site's in good shape. pH is good. We're not worried about having to incorporate lime. So there's no reason to go in and disturb all that soil and decrease your soil health. We call it kind of recreational tillage. We can just go in and we can burn out these strips, and we can plant vines right through that strip with little disturbance of the soil, and then your plants are ready to go. So typically you would burn this out with a product like glyphosate, would be the preferred product. There is no waiting time between application and Roundup. It doesn't have any residual activity. So typically we do like to wait a period of about 4 weeks to make sure that the sod that we burnt down is actually completely dead and doesn't need a second application. Another way to do it is we can actually plant through an existing crop residue. So this is actually what we did at the Upper Marlboro Vineyard location. So you can see this was a soybean field the previous year. Very good fertility, level ground, basically it was ready to go. There's no reason to go in and tear that ground up with a plow, disc it up, do secondary tillage. We just came in, we drilled our holes. If you wanted to use a mechanical planter, you would simply use a mechanical planter. We planted these by augering holes either way, and then we planted the row middles in with the sod that spring. So this works well if you're following a crop like soybeans or corn. One thing you do want to check if you are following one of those agronomic crops is what the past herbicide use was. Some herbicides that we would use for soybeans or for corn do have soil residual activity, so they remain active in the soil, and some of those materials might have a plant back restriction of 18 months. So if you applied them in May the previous year, they would still be active when you plant those grapes the next year. So you do need to know what the history was and if there are any residual materials there that you need to check on. Finally, there's this what we call a biorenovation program. So this is a program that was developed for sites that are in poor shape or have higher nematode levels. The idea is that we're increasing soil health, we're leveling out that ground, and we're also going to try to reduce the level of plant pathogenic nematodes. So what that involves is planting crops, basically cover crops that help smother out any weeds, and when those cover crops are broken down into the soil, release chemicals that actually help to kill nematodes. The two crops that we typically would use would be a Sudex crop and then a plant called dwarf Essex rape. Okay, so dwarf Essex rape is more of a cool season crop. Sorghum Sudan is a summer or warm season crop. So we're just doing alternating crops of dwarf Essex rape, which would be planted, like April-May time frame. Once that grows and gets good growth on it, we're mowing that, chopping that up into fine bits, incorporating that into the soil, letting that work for 3 or 4 weeks. So the compound that causes the damage to the nematodes is actually released when we actually hurt or break up that tissue. So we want to chop it up really fine and incorporate it into the ground. So you're going to follow the dwarf. Yes, ma'am. So that means you're mixing the crop residue into the soil. So the best way to do it would be with a rotomulcher or a rototiller. You can also use a rototiller. I mean, a disc would work, or a harrow. The best way is with a rototiller, though. And then we would follow that with a cultipacker to seal that into the ground. So the idea is that gas gets trapped within that soil profile. So you go through this based upon how big of a problem you can have. You know, it can take 2 or 3 years. Once you complete this process, then we come in the fall. Typically in this area, August 15th to September 15th, we're actually going to plant our permanent turf. We can use a hard fescue like a sheep fescue, meadow fescue, hard fescue, or we could use a tall fescue like Kentucky 31 or one of the other turf fescues. This is more common because it's a lot cheaper and a little bit more aggressive for our row middles. So I want to say something about biorenovation before we get too far. So biorenovation has been around for a long time. Paul Steiner at the University of Maryland, back when I was an undergraduate, a long time ago, 25 years or more, actually was kind of one of the pioneers behind the biorenovation program. And in certain circumstances, it can work very, very well. But if you miss a step, or if the environmental conditions are not just right, sometimes it can be somewhat unreliable. So particularly if you have higher nematode levels, I would talk with Dave or myself or Joe, what are some other things that we can use, maybe even in combination with a biorenovation program, to get those nematode numbers down. So that's going to involve using nematicides, non-fumigant nematicides, typically across that field, either across the entire field or in the rows where you're going to plant. Oftentimes we'll have you conduct a biorenovation program, then we'll come in with a crop where it's legal to use that nematicide, put it down in the row middles to try to really reduce those nematode numbers. So nematicides are typically, the good news is there's a number of non-fumigant nematicides that have been introduced in the last 4 or 5 years that have some activity. A lot of the previous nematicides are fairly harsh chemicals, like Vidate, for example, is one that's labeled now. You need your restricted use pesticide license to use Vidate, and you want to make sure you know what you're doing when you're using Vidate. But currently it's one of the best options we have for nematode control. Okay. Any questions on that? Very good. All right, so let's talk a little bit. So we have the field prepared. We're ready to plant. We need to think about field layout, how we're actually going to plant, what that trellis system might look like. So some things to consider with field layout is row orientation, topography, the row length, row spacing, and in-row plant spacing. Okay, all considerations. This is a picture of the Upper Marlboro Research Vineyard when we're getting ready to plant. So row orientation, Joe's not in the room because me and Joe normally disagree on this a little bit, so I'm glad he's not here. But so the preferred row orientation is a 10-degree offset from that north-south orientation. So this would be the row, 10 degrees offset from north to south. Okay. The way this works is, particularly in our region, particularly in southern Maryland, where it's really hot, what you want to do is try to be able to get as much early morning and morning sunlight exposure, and then you're going to get the afternoon sunlight exposure. If this is the row, and this is the sun coming up from the east, when it comes up, it's going to be hitting on this side of the row, the east side, and then when it comes out about 2 o'clock, you're a little bit offset, so when the hottest part of the day is not directly on that fruit, and then in the evening, afternoon sun, you're hitting the other side of the row. Does that make sense? Some folks don't have much tolerance for deviating from this row orientation. Personally, I don't think it makes that much difference, particularly if we have other factors like slope. So I do not like planting up and down a hill. I would rather plant perpendicular to the slope, okay? Because unless, obviously it depends on how much slope we have, for reasons of soil erosion and for practicality, with irrigation and some other things as well. But ideally, we would want to use this north-south row orientation. All right, a little bit on row length and spacing. So there's no magical answer to how long those rows should be. Just realize that the longer the row, the more efficient it's going to be to spray, if you don't have to stop and make turns every 100 feet. Also realize that if you're out picking and you have a row that's 1,500 feet long and no brakes, guess how long you have to carry those lugs or drive in to get the lugs. So that's something to consider. The other nice thing about having, typically the maximum is about 600 feet without a brake. There is some factors with the end post on a trellising system are typically much heavier than the inline post. And if you get really long, that can be a little bit of an issue as well. So around 600 feet is about the maximum that you want to go. So rows need to be straight, okay? You need to allow about 20 to 30 feet on each end. We call that the headlands that you're going to need for turning your equipment. So row spacing, this is another one. We're in the intermediate and advanced classes. You know, they're going to talk a lot about plant vigor and things you can do with row spacing and in-row spacing to control plant vigor. The standard for the industry is around 10 feet. This is going to allow most vineyard equipment to get in with little modification. You don't need to buy a specialty vineyard, narrow row vineyard tractor, for example. You can go down to about 8 feet. Once you get to points below 8 feet, you can start to have issues then with shading, where one row starts to shade out the other row. My recommendation is, you know, stay around 10 feet unless the acreage is a real problem. So in-row spacing, this is where you get a lot of variation. It can go anywhere from 2 to 10 feet, depending upon what variety and cultivar you're growing and how vigorous of a site that you have. Typically the standard is going to be between 4 to 6 feet. Most folks use a 6-foot spacing. That's somewhere around 726 vines per acre on a 6x10, so 6 feet in row, 10 feet between the rows. Wider in-row vine spacing can be warranted if you have very vigorous sites and very vigorous variety or clone selections. We can also go the other way with narrower spacing. Just realize that vines are expensive, and so the per acre costs are going to go up quite considerably if you go down to like a 3-foot spacing. Okay. If you're going to do a really intensively managed, low vigor site, really high quality wine, that's where you might want to look at some of those narrower in-row vine spacings. Okay, any questions on that? All right. So there has been a move in the last, particularly in Maryland, it might have been the case in Virginia for some time, I'm not sure, but to move to more mechanical planting. There are a couple of companies that will actually come in and do custom planting for you. It's much more efficient, much faster. They also have, I think it's noted on here, no. Oh, here it is. So these are laser guided planters. So if you need absolutely straight rows, this would be a good system to do that. The issue that we have with bringing in a custom planters, they're not going to want to come down. They'll come down to do an acre, but they're going to charge you quite a bit of money. So this is one where we talk about economy of scale and getting enough acres to really make it work. You know, the larger the area you have planted, the more efficient it is on a per vine basis to get to use a piece of equipment like this. So folks will sit in this chair, and then there's someone over there. They put the plants in. It's just like a fancy tobacco planter for those that are familiar with that. In fact, we have some growers that have converted mechanical transplanters or tobacco transplanters to be able to plant grapes as well. Obviously, if you're using a laser planter, you can get really straight rows. If you're going to be using one of those narrower row spacings, it's really important that those rows be straight because you don't have a lot of room in between these to maneuver that equipment. And if you have rows that are crooked, you're going to start to run over some vines. There's also, you can do it the old-fashioned way, and that's by hand, by using post and string to set out a nice straight line and then hand digging your own holes. This is what we did at the research vineyard. Of course, on a research vineyard, each one of these plots here is going to have a different cultivar in it, so it's almost impossible to use a mechanical transplanter to do that. So the way we did it is we augered our holes. We just used a regular post hole auger there. Dave, I think you actually are the one that did this. How long did it take you to do that 1 acre vineyard?
I did that in 1 afternoon.
1 afternoon. So once you really get going, it doesn't take that long to actually, and you want to go straight down that line. So we actually set the post after we had augered the holes, I believe. If you have a skid steer or a bobcat with an auger on it, that can make it a little bit easier if you already have the post in the ground. Well, we didn't need to tell them that. And how did you mark the holes? You used popsicle sticks, is that right?
Yeah, wood sticks. So
yeah.
Drop the auger.
Right. That's one of those little tricks. Alrighty, so here we go planting. So we planted April 6th. So, this is 2001. So when you're going to be planting in augered holes, something you need to really be careful about is where that graft union is. This is what happens if you get that graft union too low. So this is Cab Franc, I believe. And this grower, the graft union is right down here. So he augered holes, put the plants in. He didn't firm that soil up while he was planting, and he put the graft union even with the soil line. And so after the first couple of rains, that soil kind of sinks and takes that graft union with it, and now the graft union is below the soil line. What does that actually mean for where the roots are going to be coming from? Anybody see this little root here coming out? So that's coming from the scion. That's coming from the variety, not from the rootstock. And so now we lost all of our characteristics of that rootstock and our phylloxera resistance as well. So that's a common problem that new growers often have. You want to keep that graft union a good 3 inches above that soil line. Here you can see the graft union is right here, and we have that nice 3-inch area between that and the soil line. Because you will get some, particularly if you're not good at kind of firming that soil up when you plant, you'll get some sinkage there. So I'm a big proponent of irrigation on new vineyards. Some folks like to say, you know, grapes are drought tolerant, they don't need irrigation. My opinion is you're not going to be very successful in this area without it, especially for the first 2 to 3 years. It's really, really important. When we have, so the last 3 years, we've had 8 to 10 inches of rain in May and June, and we've had droughts in July and August and September. And that's very, very hard on vines when it's 100 degrees outside and bone dry. So here we are seeding the tall fescue between the rows. We just used a drill to do that. Most of you aren't going to have a drill this size. I will tell you that most soil conservation districts do have drills that you can rent out for a very small price. That makes this job a lot easier. You can also use a brilliant seeder. You can do it by hand. Just realize you want to get good seed to soil contact, so if you're going to do this by hand, you need to roll it into the soil if possible. Okay, so any questions on how we actually planted and got the vines in the ground? Yes?
Question on cover crops. Do you put anything around the vines? I thought there were some forms of cover crop that you'd actually grow right where the vines are.
In the row?
In the row.
Yeah, so that's typically not. Traditionally, we would not do that. Particularly on low vigor sites, we would keep that area open. That's our weed-free area. There is kind of a movement to growing some plants that have a really low statured plants. You know, they're only 3 to 4 inches tall. Particularly some of our clovers, like a white clover. So there's a couple of problems with having. See if I can get to a picture here. There's a couple of problems. So this area, about 1.5 feet on each side of the row is normally clear, weed-free, and we keep it that way. We might put mulch down there to help with weeds. There's a couple issues we have. One is air movement. So we do not like any types of plants growing up, foot, foot and a half, it's going to impede air movement across the bottom of that vineyard. And for disease control, that's an issue. The other problem we have is with competition for nutrients and moisture. If you have a really vigorous, particularly in the establishment years, vigorous sod, it's going to outcompete those vines for those nutrients. Now, if you have a site that's too vigorous, or if you have vines that are too vigorous, and that's one technique you can actually use. You can shorten up the spacing, or you can eliminate it altogether to eliminate or reduce the plant vigor. The only thing you have to be careful if you're going to do that, you really need to have irrigation. On most sites, especially in southern Maryland, we have really sandy soils. Grass is going to be a little better at picking up that moisture from the top of that soil. And unless there's good moisture under there that those grapes can get to, typically those grapes are going to suffer. Yes?
Yeah, if I can echo that, where we're using cover crop soil trellis, we're not using them in the first couple of years. We're keeping it weed free for at least 2 seasons to get those vines up, then allowing the cover crop in.
Yeah, and there's different trains of thought on that. Dave, I know you're just biting at the bit back there to say something.
Well, we've had an issue with crown gall, and so we looked at growth around the base of that plant, and we ended up with serious crown gall.
All right, and Dave, you know, he's a weed specialist, so we like to keep that. Dave likes to keep that weed free. Yeah. All right, so we're gonna run through on trellis construction. Just a couple things about trellis. This is not an area where you want to go out and see if you can find the best price at Lowe's for landscape timbers. You want high quality, good trellis materials that are going to be there for 20 years. There's nothing more miserable than going out and trying to replace a trellis on vines that are 10 years old. It's not a fun job. So start with good quality materials. There's lots of different systems out there. So we're going to have our inline post and then our end post here. Typically our end posts are going to be a little larger diameter, at least a 4-inch diameter, 3-inch minimum diameter for the line post. This is a standard VSP type training system where we have the trunks coming up and then the cordons going out. The canes are going to then grow up through the trellis. The height here, 32 inches. Is what we have. That there's no magical number. It really depends upon how tall you are. For somebody like me, I like 32 inches. If you're a really tall person, you can go up to 36 inches. Again, we don't want to go too low because we're going to limit air movement through there. So we don't want to be more than 28 to 30 inches or less than that. So this is what we call vertical shoot positioning. Where we have the trunks coming up, there the cordons going out, and then the shoots are going to be growing up there. These are our catch wires, and there's typically a double set of catch wires on each side of the post that we sandwich those shoots as they grow up through there, and we position those shoots throughout the season. The best way to learn about trellises is to actually visit some vineyards. See what they're doing. There's no better way to learn, and there's all kinds of different materials out there. A lot of folks are moving now to metal post instead of wood post. There's some advantages and disadvantages to that. Go out and visit some vineyards and see what they actually look like. Here's an example of a metal post here, a little cheaper in some cases, easier to drive in. They already have the clips on them for the catch wires versus they don't rot. They can get weak at the base. They're not quite as strong, in my opinion, in a lot of cases as the good wood posts that you get. Here's just some different examples. This is Black Ankle Vineyard a long time ago, and this is all metal posts. This is narrow row. As you can see there, this is a very intensively managed vineyard. There's Bellevue, Cape May. This is Jubilee Farms down in St. Mary's County. So there you can see they have a very sturdy in-post design, and then they have metal post that they're using for their inline post. This is kind of standard. It's nothing real fancy, but works well. So these are anchors, steel anchors that are anchored into the augured into the ground, and then you have your wire that goes there up to the post to hold it in. So we mentioned irrigation briefly. Again, I'm a big proponent of irrigation. Typically drip irrigation is kind of the standard of what we're going to use. This is what that system looks like. You're going to have your headlines here. Normally this is going to be buried with a permanent PVC pipe, and then we come into our drip line here. You can either put the drip line on the ground, directly on the ground, or you can attach the drip line to a wire that's about 10 to 12 inches above the ground. This is Steve Purvin's vineyard down in St. Mary's County, and you can see the advantage of this is you can use a thicker walled, what we call orchard tubing that'll last 10 or 15 years, whereas this is typically only going to last about 2 years. We also are going to damage this tubing inevitably throughout the season when we're in there cultivating, spraying, laying on the ground there. It just gets damaged and you ended up repairing it several times. But it's a fairly easy system to install. Doesn't take a lot of water and not a lot of pressure. These are normally 10 to 15 pounds of pressure operates these systems. So do your homework, find out what systems you want to try and which ones you don't. All right, so we're going to talk quickly about first year pruning. Again, there's lots of different ways that you can do this, kind of the ones we like here in Maryland. We like to select for 2 primary shoots that will eventually form the trunks. We're big proponents of 2 trunks instead of 1. We want to select shoots that are as close to the graft union as possible, opposite sides of the line and parallel to the line. You want to make sure that you prune back at the end of the year old wood so that you get at least pencil thickness or so, 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch in diameter. We want to try to go straight up. We don't like shoots that are going around all kinds of angles. We want to go up to the cordon wire as fast as we can. Again, we talked about the graft union already. Let's see if we can get some examples here. So grow tubes. So there's some advantages and disadvantages of grow tubes. And everybody has a personal opinion. I'll give mine. I'm not a big fan of these grow tubes here. In our area, we always end up with downy mildew and powdery mildew in the grow tubes. And I hate starting a vineyard with downy and powdery already started before we even have our first good year. It's almost impossible to get fungicide down in that grow tube, and because we have high pressure where we're at, I just don't like it. I do like this system. So these are kind of a modified, that's just an old 1/2 and 1/2 container. So it's only about 1.5 feet tall. You give nice protection to that vine. You let it get started. You're going to get good shoot growth, but then we can get some fungicides on this foliage as it comes out of there and protect it. So it's a little bit more open than. The nice advantage of these is that plant is really protected. You don't have to worry about things like deer damage, equipment damage, weed eater damage. And you also get a nice, tends to promote growth. Sometimes it can actually get growth a little bit too fast and end up with more of a bull cane or canes that aren't quite as strong as you would like. So there's all the benefits and limitations. Joe, where do you fall on this?
The one on the left, the only one we recommend.
Right.
The ones inside with rat problems, with cold hardiness, insects, disease development there. It's always a really difficult to manage.
Yes.
You don't get real good quality growth in there. There is a fact sheet with my pros and cons in their flash drive.
Very good. So this is the goal. Again, we're going to have these 2 trunks coming up, and that you see they cross here, cross over, so we don't lose a lot of space there in the middle. Why do we like 2 trunks? If you lose one, you still have half, right? You still got a plant. You get 1 trunk, you lose one, and you're pretty well done, or you have to train to shoot all the way up from the bottom. So in this area, we do like 2 trunks. Some places we'll only do 1. All right, so just what that progress looks like from the beginning of the season. I just want to prepare you for how fast vines and grapes can grow. So when we were planting these, Dave, we spent all this money on these vines that come in, and they look like, they look like sticks with a few roots on the bottom, right? You wonder, what in the world are we doing? So that was April 6th. There's April 24th, and they're breaking bud there. We're starting to get a little growth. Well, maybe they do have some life in them. There's a close-up. There's May. There we go through May. Now we're into July. And in July, we already have growth up to the cordon wire in this site. And there we are. So it does take a lot of work that summer. Selecting what 2 shoots you want to use, what you want to train up, taping them to the... We do use, if you can see here, we do use bamboo stakes to train those vines up. That's very important. There we are in that summer. So that summer, you can see how much growth we have on this site. So very vigorous site. And in southern Maryland and many places in Maryland, I mean, it gets hot. And if we have water to push them along, you're going to get a lot of nice growth on those vines. We use a Max Tapener. That's what he's holding there under his hand that first year to just get those shoots established. That's a pruning device. And there's September. So same year, and you can see we already have the shoots down, and we have good growth starting up the trellis system. All right, with that, hopefully you can get there. Big thing is take your time, be patient, do your homework. Don't try to do it in one season, and you'll be successful, and hopefully be successful for 15 or 20 years. So any questions for us? Yes?
Are there any signs of the nematodes without doing any soil?
Not reliably, no. Oh, sorry. So she wanted to know, is there any way we know that we have nematodes without doing an actual analysis? So pre-plant, you're talking about pre-plant? Not really. So you can know, like if you had a soybean crop growing the previous year, some nematodes cause that root galling, and so you can pull those plants and see it on the roots. Soybean cyst nematode, which is really not a problem for grapes, you can also visually see the symptoms, but you cannot see nematodes with the naked eye. You can't pull up a plant root and say, oh, this has dagger nematodes here. If you're in the position where you're really thinking about planting this spring and you didn't take nematode test, just take them now. So at least you'll have something to start with. And if you come back with high levels and it's cold, you know, when it warms up, you'd really have even more problems. Does that make sense? So we've had several folks in that position this past winter where we've ended up with problems.